Notice of the meeting has been posted for the time and manner required by law. First on our agenda this evening is our information item, the 2019-20 second quarter financial report. Dr. Dupree.
Thank you, Mr. President. As you know, the board was provided a copy of the financial update for the quarter, and Brian, our CFO, is prepared to kind of give a brief overview of what you were provided. Brian?
Thank you, Dr. Dupree. Mr. President, members of the board. I will start out by saying that there are no major areas of concern in the financial report in front of you, and there's not any significant financial challenges to report other than the legislative session action that occurred with House Bill 3, but we're confident with our fund balance we'll be able to overcome those challenges. So the general fund projection is still the same as we showed you back in January, so I'm talking about the one going forward. In the current fiscal year, we're anticipating ending the year with about a $3 million surplus. I know there was a question at the beginning of the year as to whether or not just prior to the end of the last calendar year as to whether we would end at the black. The answer to that question is yes. Based on our current projection, we are expecting that we will end the year with about a $3 million surplus in fiscal year 2019-20. So again, in the general fund, there's no bad news to report at this time, and based on our current projections, we are expecting a positive outcome there. Moving to the debt service side, as you all recall, back in January, you all did approve a parameter order. We're expecting that we'll move forward with the refunding on the 2010 and 2017 C bonds in April, along with about $75 million in commercial paper, and we'll update the board when the preliminary official statement is created, and that information will come back to you all. And then we're also issuing about $3 million and are planning to issue the last $3 million in 2007 from the 2007 bond issue. That would occur also with that transaction. I do want to mention that we met with the chief appraiser in February at the very early part of the month. At that point, they didn't feel they had enough preliminary information to provide us with an estimate and recommended that we come back to them in early March, which we're planning to do. At this point, we haven't made any changes, but based on their reaction, they didn't fall out of their chairs when we told them we were looking at an initial 5%, so we still feel comfortable with that initial estimate that we provided to the board. On the one item that may stand out to the board members is the print shop is showing a negative fund balance of about $50,000. However, the enterprise fund has a sufficient cash balance there that would be able to offset that, and we will do that transfer at year end if that fund has not replenished the balance prior to the end of the fiscal year. The other final item that I'll point out is the health fund is running currently at a positive balance. If you recall from the report last year at this time, which I don't really do that, I had to look it up, that fund was running in the in the red. However, we did make some plan change adjustments, namely in the way that we added an ACO, which is an accountable care organization option for employees. We did have some employees migrate to that plan, and we are seeing a positive outcome from the result of those changes. So at this point, we're expecting the plan to end the year in the black, and as well as next year, and we've worked with our health plan, and I just completely lost the word consultant, healthcare consultant, and the initial results they're seeing are tracking with what we're seeing, so things are looking good in the healthcare plan for the first time in probably about 18 months or so, based on the results that we're seeing. And that concludes the comments that I had. I'll be happy to answer any questions that the board may have.
I'd like to extend one thing, just this kind of brand new information, because we are getting many requests of concern about the strain of the coronavirus it's on outbreak right now. So I wanted the board and the community to know that we're working on a comprehensive plan, and the way that could potentially impact funding is if we end up with students out ill. We're getting requests from parents, what happens if they keep their children home just on a purely precautionary mode, and will we deliver instruction? Our bigger issue is, will we be funded? So we're working out plans related to all of these pieces so that we can also appeal to the Commissioner of Education to maybe make a statement about this as well, that if parents begin to withdraw children on a precautionary measure, how will that affect funding going forward? So certainly we're going to have to account for that, and there are mechanisms already in the code that allow us to apply for waivers if we take a dip below our usual averages, our historic averages. So I just want the board to know that is a potential risk to funding for this year, but there are also strategies we can engage to help mitigate that potential risk to funding as well.
Thank you, Dr. Dupree. Mr. Rice?
Thank you. Mr. Gwynn, what was the increase in enrollment the reason for us ending in the black for this calendar year?
For the current calendar year,
Yeah.
for 2020, it's a combination of enrollment as well as the way, as we've gone through the finessing, I guess, if you will, of the House Bill 3 calculations. We have seen some initial benefits, namely in the way of the transition grant, that are helping us overcome part of that negative balance that we were initially seeing.
And can you remind me how long the transition grants are good for? When will they end?
This is the first year of the transition grant. It's for 5 years, so 2024, I believe, if I did the mental math in my head correctly, would be the last year of that grant.
Does the state have the funding to sustain it through 2024, or does it have to be reauthorized in the next legislative session?
Well, as with all funding in House Bill 3, it will have to be reauthorized in the next upcoming legislative session.
They've committed to do it to 2024 if they have the money.
That is correct, sir.
Okay. And did I hear you say when you met with the chief appraiser, it's not Glenn Whitehead anymore, is it?
That is correct. Justin, and I've just completely lost his last name, but Justin Wise.
Justin White?
Jordan Wise, I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
Jordan White. Okay. Did I hear you say that you anticipated a 5% increase in the appraised value within our political subdivision?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
But is it not? I thought that House Bill 3 capped the amount of revenue we could take at 2.5%.
Yes, sir, that is a true statement. However, at this point, and going back to your earlier statement, the state is committed to making up the difference between the 2.5% cap and whatever actual growth comes in at. Now, that makes the assumption that they continue to fund it on an ongoing basis, but for this legislative session, they have funded that revenue cap above 2.5% for school districts.
So House Bill 3, they have a commitment to, in using our example here, if our property values, the total appraised value increases, do you know what that is offhand? It's over $40 billion, I think.
The 5%
appraised value.
Increase. 9 million? It's roughly 9 million.
No, it's more than that. The appraised value of the whole political subdivision.
I'm sorry.
Every house, every building, everything.
Yes, sir. That would your assessment is correct.
Okay. So even though Paul Bettencourt introduced the bill to cap our ability to take advantage of any growth above 2.5%, which over the last 20 years has happened maybe one time, the state is committed to making up the difference between 2.5% and whatever the value actually is?
Based on the taxable value, yes, sir, that is correct.
Okay.
And again, I want to emphasize that is funded for this legislative session.
Right.
The concern is, how does that look beyond the current biennium?
Okay. And his predecessor, a couple of years ago, overestimated the revenue when Mr. Bassett was here. And of course, you know all about that. And so it's just really, you have a very challenging job, the same job Glenn Hagar has, and that's to anticipate what our revenue is going to be so we can build our budget. And when are we going to vote on that?
We will vote on the budget in June.
And the tax rate in July?
In September.
September. And so is the TEA going to certify the taxable values this year?
The plan is for TEA to certify the taxable values. I'm providing editorial commentary now, so this is me speaking as almost a private citizen, but as well as the CFO. They have committed to doing that, but this is the first time they have ever done that. So how that will look and what the appeals process will look like, if it doesn't look as we're expecting, we don't know. So there's still a lot of uncertainty around that, and I think that may be the point that you're trying to make, is that unfortunately, the way that this is structured for this year is going to look very different than it has historically, and there's going to be a lot of uncertainty on the district's behalf on what that's actually going to look like and what the outcome will be for us.
Okay, and So I know that what I'm hearing you say is that we are in good shape, at least at this point in time, as we look to the future and we do our best to get closer and closer to what we can call, absolute value. We're looking good, and so I don't want anyone to misconstrue my comments about any kind of a tax increase. But when I think into the future, and I think into the next biennium, if they cannot make up the funds which they've promised to pay, kind of like Congress does with the IDEA grants, then we might be forced to actually, they may, because of this 2.5% revenue cap, force us to raise our M&O tax rate. And I heard that before we could do that, even though we're not planning that right now, I want everybody to be real clear, we're not planning that, we would have to have an efficiency audit. And I know they're posting videos on their website to provide guidance as they try to figure out what the legislature has passed, but have they defined what an efficiency audit would consist of yet?
Yes, sir, they have. As a matter of fact, late last week, they released the parameters of what that looks like. I would say the positive side to that is that it's very fill in the blank, if you will, the initial template they provided. So hopefully that will provide some degree of clarity. We'll start the process of plugging our information in to determine where we may have areas that we would want to specifically address before going out for TRE. Again, if the board opted to go that direction. But at this point, as we told the board at our update in January, we would not expect to request that of the board or make that recommendation to the board in this current year, perhaps in the next school year.
Okay. Well, we're going to have an audit report from Gibson Consulting in the next several weeks, and I just want everybody to know that Fort Bend ISD has a very robust internal audit program where we are auditing all aspects of our operation, from child nutrition to transportation to procurement to human resources to everything. And in my mind, that's an ongoing best practices and efficiency audit that we have been undertaking for the last 6 years, ever since Dr. Dupree got here. And I would challenge any school district in the state to match our internal audit program. So I just want our friends and neighbors at home to know we're doing a good job with that. And Dr. Dupree, I'm going to be quiet in a minute, but here's one quick question of our total number of staff. So as Mr. Gwynn is building our budget, if I am at a backyard barbecue and someone says, hey, you've got 3 administrators for every teacher, you can afford to lose a few people, that is patently false, correct?
That is correct, sir.
And so we roughly have half of our staff are actually in the classroom.
Over half of our staff.
So I hear comments from, I've been moderating some candidate forums, and they're talking about they want to put more money in the classroom and get it out of the ivory tower, if you will, of the administration. But Mr. Gwynn, would I be correct in saying that the TEA has ratios where they measure the number of staff we have in the central office, the number of campus administrative staff, and the number of teachers? Don't they have ratios that we have to fall within in order to get our big time first financial report from the controller?
Yes, sir. There are ratios that we have to follow, and we have consistently met those ratios.
So anyone running for office, I would point them in the direction of that to answer questions, that we're running a pretty tight operation here and still achieving high student achievement. And we've made difficult decisions, for example, several years ago with our reading recovery program, which we terminated, not because it wasn't effective, but because the cost per student was cost prohibitive, and we needed to reach more students. And that has led to us embracing the literacy program that's currently in place, and we're all so pleased that it's yielding very positive results. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Mr. Rosenthal.
Thank you, sir. Actually, to your previous question about admin, I think the administration showed a slide when we were at Pecan Grove. It was the TAPER report, I believe, and it showed our central admin as a percentage of total was like 0.5%, right? Versus the state average, which was, I think, 2%.
Correct.
So that's
Half of 1%.
yeah. So that's good. Anyway, Brian, you mentioned something about a healthcare option that seemed to have been lowering some costs for us. What was the name of that?
It's an ACO, and I'm going to have to look back at the acronym because I just call it an ACO.
Okay.
It's the Accountable Care Organization model, and essentially it's a somewhat narrow band of, it's a single provider, in this case Memorial Hermann, and if you're a part of that plan, the lab work and all of the work is contained within the within the Memorial plan, so that they hopefully can contain those costs, and we have seen positive results from that.
Okay, good. I thought when I read through this, when you were talking about the healthcare, that we had a slight uptick, like recently, maybe January. But overall, we're down for the year.
Yes, sir, that is correct. And typically what we see in the November and December timeframe, and again
That's
in the
for sure.
June and July timeframe, a higher number of claims, and that's because teachers are out and they tend to access healthcare at that point in time.
Everyone wants to use their end of the year, although our end of the year is school year, right?
Correct.
Okay.
We have the end of the school year, yes, sir. That again, that happens usually in the summer time frame. But also, as you mentioned, if someone has taken advantage of the flex option and they have a flex account, they need to utilize all of those funds before year end, or they lapse, and
Okay.
they don't get to keep that funding.
Okay, all right. And then when you were talking about caps, the cap does not affect the INS fund, right?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Okay, all right. Okay, thank you.
You, Mr. Rosenthal. Mrs. James.
Great questions, thank you, and thank you for the answers. Also, thank you for, I'd asked some questions about fund balance and the calculation of fund balance, so I appreciate the detailed answer that you gave me to that. I have just a general question, and we don't need to answer it right now if we don't know it off the top of our heads, but I'm wondering what policy do we have that speaks to the fund balance, or do we have a policy around that? Is that in the investment strategy? Or
It's in the fiscal and budgetary strategy, yes,
Fiscal and
ma'am.
budgetary strategy. So that's one of those strategies that we vote on, and it comes up each year. It's not connected particularly to a certain policy number. Is that?
That is correct. It is a board policy that was created outside of the official policy framework.
Okay, kind of like their investment strategy in the same category as that.
Yes, ma'am. What I would say is that the weight that carries, we view as equal to policy. So when it's prescriptive in there, we follow that and consider it to be board policy, if you will, even though it's not titled as such.
All right, and that's what you use when you're when we're applying for these for our financing options, to make sure that we have good credit, I guess, and because that defines, I guess, how you defines for the lending agencies our strategies and our policy around it.
Correct. It signifies to the rating agencies and the people who will be purchasing the bond, the board's commitment or the governing body's commitment to following those strategies. So it's very important that it be board authorized so that they understand that when they purchase the debt, there is a commitment to fiscal responsibility that's underlying that debt.
Excellent. Okay, one other question. You said at the very beginning, and Mr. Rice brought this up as well, that you anticipate that we'll finish the year about $3 million in the black. Can you remind me, does that include the $21 million that we got from Hurricane Harvey settlement, or is that in a different? How does that? How do those things relate? Yeah.
So the Hurricane Harvey funding was recorded in the prior year. So
Okay.
this $3 million is over and above that funding level, meaning that there's not 17, we haven't used 17 million of it, and there's 3 million left. There's literally 3 million over and above that 21 million from the Hurricane Harvey hold harmless.
Okay, thank you very much.
And if I may add one more comment related to the Gibson audit, Mr. Rice. You mentioned that the board has that done, and I would like to point out that Gibson reports directly to the board, not to staff. So when that audit comes in, the reviews are filtered through the audit committee, not through staff. So that has a little higher degree of, well, we audit ourselves. It's an external audit firm that's doing that work.
I challenge the legislature to do the same.
Mr. Gwynn, in the past, in an attempt to keep our healthcare costs down, we were doing some training for our employees. Are we still doing that?
Yes, sir, we are.
Okay.
We continue to do that, and we engage with Gallagher, our consultant firm, who helps us with that, and that's something we'll continue to do to ensure that we keep those costs either stable or hopefully decline over time.
You might also mention about this year's the year we're bidding those services as well.
I could hear there was a rustle right in my ears, you said.
I might also mention that this is the year we're bidding our healthcare.
Yes, sir, that is correct. So the plan administrator is currently United Healthcare, and we're required to go out for bid every, I believe, 5 years on that. This is the final year of their contract. So the bidding is currently out on the street. We expect those results to come back, and we'll go through that process. We do anticipate if there is a change in provider, there could be changes to the plan design. However, at this point, we don't know what that looks like, as we're still awaiting the results of that.
Mr. Rosenthal?
I guess, when we have that discussion, I'll hold it till then. So.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gwynn. We appreciate the information. If it's okay with my board, instead of going in a closed session right now, we're going to skip along and take care of the 6A portion of our agenda, and we will stop with our last policy, GKA local. So, if I may, we're going to go ahead and skip down to 6A1 and review a resolution adopting the EVS 6020 voting system. Dr. Dupree?
As we get into that, I would add, I know the board has, some board members have requested a demonstration of the system, and we are working with the county to provide that. Definitely, they have committed to being here on the day of the board meeting, but we're trying to set up another opportunity, not this week, but the week after spring break, at the board's convenience to be able to come in. So if you can, Jesselyn in my office will be working with you to set up some times, and working with Mr. Scamardo to set up an opportunity for you to come if you'd like to demo that system as well.
Mrs. James, or I'm sorry, Mrs. Haliger, I'm sorry, I didn't see it.
We look alike. Yeah, so thanks for that, providing us that update. I know it's not necessarily the demonstration to the board members, but I think it's really about the community understanding that there is a different method of how we're going to be voting, that there's going to be a two-step process in the voting system. So I think that's really what the questions are about, in order for our community to understand that something's going to be different. I think the May election will provide their first opportunity to do this in preparation for the November election. We have a smaller populace that votes in our May election. I encourage people to vote in the May election. However, I know that's the first opportunity for people to see this new system, because they're not getting it right now. So I think that's really what it's about: training and showing, and the community that they'll have to do something different.
That's good insight. One of the things that I'll work with Rob on, though, is really the county has to accept responsibility for that piece of it. But I think what we have to do, since we are the first major election in our community using the system, is we're going to have to do our part in communicating to our stakeholders and support that. But we'll also be working with the county to get that out broadly as well, so that we're sharing that responsibility.
Mrs. James?
Yeah, I'll just echo that. So when I went in to vote for the primary, I talked to the election judge that was on site at the polling place where I went, and she said that they have seen one demonstration of the machines, and it's going to require them as election judges to be very active in the process of making sure people don't leave with their piece of paper and things like that. So there's going to be a two-step, there's going to be some good things, and it's going to be like a touch screen, but there's going to be some more difficult things in that there's a two-step process. So she seemed to indicate that there might be a video available, and so if that's the kind of thing that we could get a link to or put a link to the county, whatever the county has for training, I think that that would be important. But I think it's important for us to all know about it so that we can talk about it when we're out on the campaign trail. So that's why I would like to have a demonstration or come to a time before the board meeting or something like that where we can see how it works.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Ms. Helliger?
Do we have an option in this process?
In the option of adopting the system or not? Technically, no. Statute requires that the board has to adopt it, but the county has purchased it, and we have a competing obligation to have a joint election with the county. So,
Okay.
but we certainly, the
Wow,
county certainly
roll my head.
understands the concern you have about training and getting the word out. So.
Okay, all right, thanks.
One last comment, Mrs. Sofer, are you aware that there is any type of a YouTube video, and can we get it out if there is, and some type of communication?
We'll certainly be reaching out to them and ask for access to any promotional materials. They may have some collateral materials as well as videos that might be helpful that we can post on our website and then also make available to our community.
Would it be unrealistic for us to make one if they didn't have one available?
I don't know that we have the leeway, just because maybe some of the proprietary information. I'll defer to Rob for that.
Well, there is information the manufacturers put out about the system that basically is their marketing information that they have put out to the counties who are interested in purchasing it. So yeah, we can certainly get materials, and I think we would just have to look to see whether it's tailored to Fort Bend ISD or whether we would want to do something on our own. But I don't think there would be any problem with us taking what they have and making it to fit our needs.
All right, thank you very much. Are you done? Okay. Mrs. James?
I'm sorry, one more question. What's the name of the system that we're going to be using? What's it called?
It's-
in case I want to Google it or YouTube it.
It's the hanging Chad system.
It's the EVS 6020.
Okay, so that's what's in
That's the name
agenda.
of it. It's by the company is ES&S.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Scamardo. Moving along to 6A2, review the joint election agreement and contract for election services with Fort Bend County. All right, any questions or comments about this? Moving right along to 6A3. Mrs. James, will you help?
Well, if I might interject, the board book includes, there's a couple of typos in the philosophy of BVD, this first policy we're considering. Nothing substantive, but we need to correct those. We attempted to do that and gave you a bad version of that corrected, so disregard what is on your place and just look at what's in the book, knowing that it'll be corrected by the time we ask you to vote on it.
Thank you, Dr. Dupree. Mrs. James, will you help lead us through this portion of the agenda?
Yes, so really, though, I can only lead you through the first portion, or the first policy, because the first policy is the only one that went through the policy committee. So that's really the one that's in the governance category. The other 6 that are listed there went on the fast track, not through the policy committee, but through the administration. And my understanding is they're going through the board president and the superintendent.
That's right.
And then placed sort of as a scalable system sort of model, so that we can get these legal changes made in a expeditious way.
Yes, ma'am.
So the only one I know of this list that I know much about is the very first one, and like Dr. Dupree said, there's a couple of typos in the version that's in the board book, but other than that, it's pretty good. We added quite a bit of quite a bit of, I guess, content, if you will, to get our philosophy around this in terms of the trustees need to be well-trained, and they need to work with the superintendent as a team of 8 and build trust and build relationships in order to be an effective board. So that's the main thing that's there. We put some specifics in about content for candidates, content for newly elected or appointed trustees, brand new trustees, and then ongoing content in valuing team building with the group. So that's it for that one. That's all I know.
Thank you, Mrs. James. All right, as you had stated, the rest of the policies we'll go through, but in an attempt to streamline the way in which we do policy, myself and the administration and myself and Dr. Dupree are looking at the rest of these policies to see if there is any mission or vision in these specific policies. We reviewed them and there are not. These are more compliance type of updates and or changes. So with that being said, 3B is CKE, our safety program, risk management, and security personnel.
Anthony, would you like to talk through each of these, please?
Certainly. So good evening, President Burdine, board members, Dr. Dupree. The following 6 policies are, as Ms. James had mentioned, fast track directly to the board, as there are just very minor revisions due to 86 legislature, just to help our district remain in compliance. And so the recommended revisions are nominal in scale, and again, just based on compliance. So I'll touch on the highlights for these recommended revisions for these 6 policies. CKE is around safety program risk management, and there's a phrase added in that prohibits district peace officers or school resource officers from being assigned routine discipline or school administrative tasks. DFFA is a reduction in force financial exigency policy. There's a minor revision to furloughs.
You might see if there's any questions on each one before you
One at a time?
move through them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions or comments about the CKE local? All right, go ahead, Dr. I.
Okay, so DFFA is reduction in force financial exigency, and is a minor revision to furloughs, and basically it directs to another policy, and that's a result of House Bill 3 moving provisions from Education Code Chapter 42 to Chapter 48.
Mr. Rice.
Dr. Indelicato, here is my question. In 2010, Fort Bend ISD declared a state of financial exigency and RIF 400 teachers. So at that time, per state law, we had to notify the teachers 30 days prior to the last day of instruction that they were going to be non-renewed. I believe the following year, the legislature changed that to 30 days after the last day of instruction. Can you tell me if I'm correct in that understanding, if we were going to have a reduction, and if we declared a state of financial exigency, when would we inform the teacher that they were not going to be they would be non-renewed?
I can speak to that. Okay. So the law previously, Mr. Rice, was I believe 45 days before the last day of instruction, and they changed it to 30 days. So that's what still stands now. We have to give at least 30 days before the last day of instruction.
Okay. And I was reading through hastily, but how would you, so you have defined how you would determine if you were going to non-renew a teacher?
Yes. Yes, sir. It gives the order of considerations you would have to make.
Qualifications, performance. So when would the performance evaluations take place?
It would generally be based on the prior year. So whatever's in their personnel file at the time you make the decision. And then any subsequent documentation that's been recorded during the year as well could be considered.
So if the last day of instruction is near the end of May, and now it's 30 days, so we'd have to notify them around May 1 or the end of April, but you would have had to have done your homework and pretty far in advance of that.
Yes.
And so when would we declare a state of financial exigency in order to accomplish all of that work and comply with the law?
Well,
It seems like it would probably be March.
it would be at least February or March, yes, sir.
Okay.
Because as you know, with our budget process, the way we work here, we know in January or February what's anticipated. The only unknown would be a pending legislative session. But generally, even we've had to deal with these kinds of things even during legislative sessions, but the decision will always be made far enough in advance to give it plenty of notice. Usually, we're going to shoot in advance of the 30 days. We don't want to cut it that close. But we would always make a decision like that very early.
And to the extent possible, it shouldn't come as a surprise to the individual. I'm not saying we don't have to worry about it right now because Mr. Gwynn has reported we're in good financial shape. But that's why we have policy for those times when this occurs and we don't have to think it up on the fly. So I just want to make sure we have a good, solid process in place to afford our teachers the opportunity to, if they're falling behind, to improve and that kind of thing, so they're not summarily
That's right.
dismissed.
Yes, sir. And I would add too, just since we're on this topic, because it just kind of makes my stomach queasy to talk about these kinds of things, that one of the things the board and community needs to always understand, if we ever feel like we're facing that severe of a financial crisis, we will be strategic in how we address it. I mean, because you have to realize we already turn over 400 to 500 teachers every year. So in most cases, there would not be a reason, barring unforeseen, extreme financial crisis, that we would ever have to even release anyone from a job. We would generally be able to do it through attrition, and we would always be very strategic about that based on the
Okay.
practices we have in place.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear that, and I appreciate that. But we did go through that in 2010. It was extremely painful, and it's etched in my memory.
Yes.
So thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Ms. Helliger?
Thank you. I do have a question. I think I heard two things. One, I heard you say that it's based on their performance evaluation of the previous year. That's what I heard him say.
Generally, that's the last, if you're doing if you're having to make these decisions in February and March, that's going to be the last one that's in the file. So I know districts handle those things different ways. Some expedite evaluations to get them done sooner. You also will have kind of a mid-year, the mid-year touch point on their appraisal that could be as a reference point as well. But generally, you're not going to have that year's cycle completed of the teacher evaluation until later in the spring.
So that's why I'm asking the question, because if you are a low performer and you've been put on, I don't know what's called here, a performance improvement plan of some sort, and you are improving, maybe because of you moved to a different school, different leadership, whatnot, and you have a substantial change in performance, because performance is subjective. I want to make sure that, if we ever have to do this, we're being truly fair to those people. That's the first question. And then the second one is that I noticed on page 56, it says seniority, the length of service in the district as measured from the employee's most recent date of hire. Is that something that is mandated to us? So am I reading this correctly, that's saying that a person's, it's kind of one of those last in, first out?
That's correct. But let me
Is that
clarify.
mandate? I want to make sure, is that mandated to us?
No, ma'am, this is
Okay.
our local policy.
Okay.
But I would also point out, these are done in order from 1 to 4. So often in districts, and I think even here, the policy used to have seniority as the first item. But what you end up doing when you have seniority as your first item is you end up releasing good teachers who join the organization later. And so that's why we now go by qualifications first, and then their performance as at the top two, to make sure that we're retaining the most high-quality teachers regardless of their tenure.
So,
that this is a local decision, this order is a local decision.
okay, so I'm not clear whether or not this was, I see criteria, and I didn't see it as something that's being done in order, per se. I mean, I look at these are the 4 criteria that is used.
In the paragraph ahead of that,
Okay.
it says clearly follow them in order.
Okay, good. All right, good. I must have missed that. Sorry about that. So even with that said, why do you have to have seniority? Why do you have to have seniority? Because I just want the best teachers. I don't care if you've been there 2 years, 20 years. Why do we have to use seniority as a measurement?
Well, it's lowest on the list, but you might have to have a tiebreaker at some point if you are truly doing a RIF. And you've got a lot of teachers who are all on exactly the same level of performance. They're all good. They've all got extra duties. They all have the right professional background. You may have to break a tie about who gets to stay and who doesn't.
I don't know. I mean, I would like to hear from other folks because I just think it's something that I'm not familiar with. When that's not how I would do it. In my line of work.
I agree with you. We all want the highest qualified teachers, but as Dr. Dupree is pointing out, what this is saying, if the superintendent at his or her discretion decides the documented performance differences between 2 or more are too insubstantial to rely upon, they can proceed to apply the remaining criteria. So then they would go down and say, well, this person's got extra duties. Here's the professional background, and then so it's really, as Dr. Dupree said, it really is a tiebreaker when you've got 2 people who are virtually equal in other.
Okay, because the reason why I asked, I know this is about an extreme circumstance, but I've heard many times where people have said, "Oh, we've moved people, or we've done some changes, and it was based on seniority." And at the end of the day, seniority to me is not really a criteria for me. It's qualifications and quality of work. So, and so I just wanted to make sure I understood this and the community understood it too.
So no, that's a good question, and I don't know the policy number, but what you're referring to falls under program changes and other types of relocation. And in that case, seniority is used because that goes to the idea that every teacher on a contract is a district employee regardless of where they work. And so to go to one school and I think the ELC that they were opening at Hunters Glen is a good example, because all of the pre-K through first grade teachers at that school are being reassigned to other jobs in the district. So it would not be fair to them to do that based on performance only, because then you're identifying teachers on a scale and moving the teachers who are less high performers to other schools. It's more fair if you're reallocating among the district to do it based on seniority, because it's acknowledging that all teachers are equal in regard to their contract status with the district. And so seniority allows that teacher, the idea is that they work at the school they want to be at. And so it's not a good thing necessarily to be asked to go to a different school when we're changing a program like that, but that acknowledges that the teachers who've been there, who've chosen to be there, get to stay because they've committed to that school for an extended period.
Okay, thank you for that. So I do want to bring this back up. I know this is, if it's not in this particular policy, I do want to have a good discussion about that. Because I do think, I don't know if I necessarily totally agree with that statement. So if we can figure out how we can put that back on our agenda to discuss. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hellier. Moving along to 6A3D, DH Local Employee Standards of Conduct.
Yes, so for this policy, there are 2 pieces. One is deleting language requiring firearms and locked vehicles to be unloaded. And then we articulated language to state license to carry permit instead of handgun license.
All right. Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
All right, next policy is FFAA, Wellness and Health Services, Physical Examinations. And this just really had one addition, which it expands the superintendent's authority to require physical examinations and submit statements from healthcare providers prior to a student's participation beyond what UAL already requires.
Mr. Rosenthal?
The thing that I saw in there, it seemed like it kept scratching out the word athletic. So did it used to, I mean, was the legal policy or the law only students who were in UIL athletic programs? Has it now been expanded to any UIL program that you have to have physicals?
This year is the first year where marching band is also incorporated in UIL.
Okay.
As well as ROTC, those kinds. So the goal was to expand the policy to other activities beyond only athletics.
But obviously that's a legal requirement, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. Go ahead, Dr. I.
Great. So the next policy is FL student records, and this includes a statement appointing a person to serve on a team supporting the district's safe and supportive school program. And lastly, we have GKA local, community relations, conduct on school premises, and similar to the previous policy, DH, we remove the words loaded not as Senate Bill 494 prohibits districts from regulating the manner in which weapons are stored in a locked vehicle, and again articulated language to state license to carry permit instead of handgun license.
Mrs. James?
This is going back to the previous one, FL local. So you said we were assigning somebody to be the person who's in charge of the records, except we've crossed out or designee in all the sections, and we're just saying the superintendent's in charge of the records?
BJA had an addition where it says superintendent or designee, and so policies following thereafter, they're taking out the word designee because it's inferred that the superintendent already has the authority to delegate. That's why that's being removed, designee.
Okay, so where is who is the person, and it's just the superintendent?
Well, again, in BJA, it says superintendent or designee, and so that's applied throughout then other policies. That's why they're removing designee in others. Is that the question you're asking, Ms. James?
Kind of. I don't think I get it, but I'll think about it. Maybe it'll come to me.
Okay.
Mr. Rice?
Well, Dr. Indelicato, I'm not understanding that either.
Thank you, Jim.
So where are you saying because it's called out in another policy that we don't need to include it in this policy?
Yes, so in BJA, that policy, it does state that superintendent has the authority to delegate responsibilities. And so what we're seeing from TASB when they have recommended updates is that they're removing the word designee because it's in BJA, that the superintendent can designate.
Okay. Are you saying B as in boy, JA?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so they're saying if it's shown up once, don't repeat it, so we don't have to change it throughout the entire document. Anytime we make a change, is that what they're saying?
They're removing designee in many policies because, again, in BJA it says superintendent has the authority to have a designee to delegate that.
Well, student records and student data is one of the most important things that we have to safeguard. And I'm not arguing with you, but I am concerned about how we're doing that. And of course, Mr. Pham has to protect cyber terrorists who want to steal this data from us. And I just want to make sure that wording is correct. I don't know if maybe it is, but I'm just questioning. I don't see anything in here about when you're talking about having. I thought there was something in here about contractors accessing this data. I don't see any language in here about them having to sign a data sharing agreement.
Yes, that's on, Mr. Rice, it's on page 3 of 5 of that policy, page 69, I believe you're referring to.
Okay.
That a contractor retained by the cooperative, it's at number 3.
Okay.
So it's kind of identifying who would have access through their relationship with the district.
But it doesn't say they have to sign a data sharing agreement.
Long, have you worked on that?
I think it needs to say somewhere in there, because if you assign this to someone, Dr. Dupree, what if they don't realize that the contractor needs to sign a data sharing agreement if they're going to have access to personnel files, not just student data, but personnel data? And I don't know who, we don't use ADP. Who do we use? Well, do we use PeopleSoft, or do they have access to all that information? I mean, do we have a data sharing agreement with them in case they get hacked?
No, we right now we have on-premise, so we control that data. We don't have it in the cloud, sir.
Oh, okay, well, that's good. But I just think that we need something in there about a data sharing agreement. If somebody, for example, PASA, needs some demographic data from us, they would sign a data sharing agreement.
How do we handle that now?
Right now, we usually have a protection agreement for every contract that's being signed that's dealing with data, whether it's student or employees. And we're working through our legal department to make sure that each and every one of those vendors sign. And we also go back, as we renew old contracts, we ensure that they do sign those DPAs as well.
Okay, that's good. But should that be included in our local policy? I just think that if we had a breach, God forbid, and then the media is contacting us saying you don't even have anything in local policy to address this, why not?
Well, it is a very valid concern, and we, as Mr. Pham said, have been focused on, I guess, where we felt the risk was the largest in terms of those contractual arrangements between the district and other entities. And certainly in certain situations, depending upon who the contractor was, there have been agreements signed, mostly recognizing that under FERPA, this is protected information and not available to be shared. So,
but I think what I hear Mr. Rice saying, which makes sense to me, is that we never explicitly say in this policy that we require a data sharing agreement with any of these parties. I mean, I'm not seeing anything in this policy that speaks to a data sharing agreement.
right, in FL it doesn't. I think it's going to speak to it more in the C series, like in the CQ where it talks about technology and those sorts of things, but we
Okay.
can double check to make sure. But that's why I don't think you'd see it in FL, because this is a student.
So that's what we need to then is follow up to determine, is it clearly spelled out in a policy somewhere about that? Okay.
Okay,
So
Yeah.
that's the heart of the issue that I hear you asking.
that's correct.
Yes, sir.
If you could let us know, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
We'll do
We're in
that.
a process of developing the CQB, which is the new cybersecurity policy. So we will make sure that it's included in there.
Go ahead.
Okay, so, Mr. Rice, thank you for bringing that up. And that's a really good lead-in, Mr. Pham, to a comment I'd like to make, because the policy committee has looked at the cybersecurity policy, and we started to look at that, and we also started to look at the technology resources policy, and some of these same topics about data release and protection of data started to come up. I think that we need to have a little information session about that for the board, because I didn't feel that I, as the policy chair, had enough knowledge both of the topic or of the rest of my colleagues' opinions and views on the topic to be able to write and bring forward a good policy. So I think all these things are a little bit connected with regard to the topic. So I think we need some information. We maybe need some of that maybe needs to be behind closed doors so that we can have a full understanding of our situation. Please.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Mr.
I
Rosenthal?
have one other
Okay,
comment
sorry.
related to something that Mr. Rice brought up, and that is with regard to the superintendent or designee. So with all due respect, Dr. I, we don't always agree with everything that TASB suggests in a policy. And as I've been doing this policy committee for several years now, and we've been very clear on the things that we want the superintendent to be in charge of, or he can delegate to a designee. We're in the middle of reviewing BJA right now, and I'm not sure we have anything in there except for the specific thing about communications director that talks about delegating authority. So that's another piece of this. If we're going to cross off designee, then I'm expecting the superintendent is a custodian of the records. He cannot delegate that to someone else. That's how I read this, because we're not going to cover it and reference it in another policy. So I think we should make it say what we want it to say.
That's good feedback. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Rosenthal.
I would agree with both those comments. It's just a couple of words. We're not being super efficient by taking those couple of words out of a policy. So, and that goes to, I think, the other one as well. I mean, just if there's concern enough about it, let's just put in each one of those policies, let's just put something in there about either data sharing agreements or whatever the wording we want to be, and be done with it. So, I mean, that way it's clear. It's clear everywhere. So I don't think we're going to get criticized because we have 3 extra words or 5 extra words in a policy. So.
All right. Thank you for the conversation. It's good stuff. Moving along to 6A3G, or GKA Local Community Relations Conduct of the School Premises. Dr. Delicato.
Yes, sir. So GKA is similar to DH again, in that it deletes language requiring firearms to be unlocked vehicles to be unloaded.
Ms. James.
Okay, so I have one other question on all 6 of these. Could you get for us and tell us what the dates are when we last revised these? Because all the dates that I'm seeing down here look like the date of the TASB update from November of 2019, and I'd like to know how recently or how far in the past we have previously revised these policies.
Yes, we can certainly provide that.
Mr. Rice.
Dr. Delicato, are we saying that if a person has a valid Texas license to carry, we can store a handgun in the trunk of our car in the parking lot? It doesn't say, does it say it has to be unloaded? It used to say that. Now it doesn't. It's not in plain view. So we're going to let people bring handguns to school and keep them in the car?
That's what the law says.
When did that change?
The last legislative session. With the
Wow. Okay. Well, I was just kind of surprised. I think it's a really bad idea. If I'm a teacher and at some event, God forbid it happens, shouldn't I be sheltered in place with my kids in the classroom?
I don't think we're expecting them to go out to their car and retrieve it and engage. I think the concern was, if I'm driving from my home to work, I don't have a way to protect myself when I'm legally able to do so, because the district policy says I can't keep it in my car on property.
Okay. That's good to know when I'm driving down Highway 59 now. So, okay. Thank you.
Ms. Helliger, did you have a comment?
Okay, just for clarity, the law says, do you have the law? I mean, does someone have the reference to the law? Can you get me the reference to the law?
Dr. Ida, do you have a copy of that law?
It is referenced in there.
It's House Bill 1143. I don't have a copy with me, but it's.
Okay.
I don't have a copy with me.
And so basically it says, I just want to make sure I'm totally clear with this, that I can have my Bessie with me, Bessie can go in the car, go in the glove compartment, it can be loaded.
Yes. So basically, your car is an extension of your home. And so just like you can have a weapon inside your home, you can have a weapon in your car, even without a license to carry. That is an extension of your home. Okay, but if you're going to take that weapon out of your car into any other place that's not restricted, then you have to have a license to carry to do that. And if you have a license to carry, you can carry it either concealed